Good afternoon, everyone. We're here for Mrs. Ballou Reads, and we're continuing the adventures of Tumtum and Nutmeg beyond Nutmouse Hall. If you remember, Aunt Ivy came to visit because she had an infestation of mice at her own place, so she came to stay indefinitely with the family. And she has discovered that there are mice who wear clothes, of all things, in this house, and she's very upset, and she has set a trap, and she has put some poison, which Tumtum thought was just chocolate. And when we left Tumtum and Nutmeg, Tumtum had just eaten a bunch of the chocolate and had dropped to the floor, or his book had dropped to the floor. He was feeling very, very strange. Oh no, let's see what happens. Chapter 7. Tumtum could feel a violent, tearing pain in his stomach, as though he had swallowed a piece of barbed wire. Then his head began to pound, as if a hammer were being knocked back and forth inside his skull. And then he began to choke. Nutmeg was on the top of the dresser when she heard the sudden explosion of spluttering and gulping, and it gave her such a start she knocked over her pail of soapy water. She jumped to the floor like a cricket and hurtled into the dollhouse to her husband's side. Tumtum's face was purple and blotchy. There was sweat streaming from his brow, and his hands were tearing frantically at his tie. He was shaking, and his breath was coming in painful spasms. Nutmeg started thumping him on his back and pressed a glass of water to his lips. Poison! Nutmeg, he whispered, pointing toward the fateful plate of chocolate. Mouse, Then his voice was swallowed by another violent fit of spluttering. Nutmeg felt a deep dread stabbing through her. Mouse poison? It can't be, she thought wildly, for she knew there was no worse horror. The coughing finally subsided, and Tumtum slumped, exhausted in his chair. He raised his face weakly toward the children's bed. Why would they have done this to us, Nutmeg? He asked gently. Surely we never did them any harm. Then his eyes became lusterless, and the lids drooped. Nutmeg knew she must get him back to Nutmouse Hall at once before he lost consciousness. She put an arm beneath his shoulders and raised him to his feet. Come on, Tumtum, she urged, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. We must get you home. You'll feel better once you're tucked in bed. But all the while, Nutmeg's mind was racing. The nearest mouse doctor, Dr. Goodmouse, lived nearly 2 miles away in the next village. You had to cross a ford and then climb a very steep hill to get there. It was a hard enough journey in fine weather, but even the fittest mouse would be reckless to undertake it in the snow. She would have taken any risk for Tumtum's sake, but if she perished on the journey, then he would have no one to look after him at all. Besides, she knew that when it came to poison, there was generally little a doctor could do. It always took several days for poison to work its way through a mouse's body, and there was no medicine that could stop its course. Some mice were violently sick for a fortnight, then went on to recover. But if Tumtum had eaten a lot of it, he would be lucky to survive the week. Nutmeg prayed he had consumed only a small mouthful, but then he did so gobble his food. Her fear deepening, she guided Tumtum inch by inch across the floor. Then she supported him as they stumbled together down the attic steps. But by the time they came to the main stairs, he was so weak that Nutmeg had to slide him down the trim wrapped in her apron, then virtually carry him across the kitchen floor to Nutmouse Hall. Here we are on the stairs. He was too exhausted to climb upstairs to his bedroom, so Nutmeg made a nest for him in the living room on the chaise lounge. He tossed and turned all night, retching into a basin and whimpering in pain. His breathing was hot and labored, and his complexion oscillated between purple and green. Nutmeg pressed a glass of water to his lips, but he seemed unable to swallow. Watching his livid face, she felt a cold tremor going down her spine. She knew then she wouldn't mind if Tumtum never fully recovered. She wouldn't mind if he were an invalid, and if she had to nurse him for the rest of his life. But she knew she couldn't face him dying. You're going to be all right, Tumtum, she kept saying to him. But she didn't feel at all sure. For the next 5 days, Nutmeg barely left her husband's side. His condition showed no signs of improving, and any glimmers of hope were short-lived. On Sunday afternoon, his temperature suddenly went down. but by midnight it was up again, higher than before. On Monday morning he managed to eat a few mouthfuls of dry toast and to swallow some milk, but then he was terribly sick, and for the next 2 days he didn't eat anything at all. For most of the time he was delirious. One morning he asked Nutmeg to send a telegram to his mother, who had died before they were married. And the next evening he suddenly sat up and hurled a glass across the room, shouting, "Out! Out!" as if he imagined someone to have broken in. Nutmeg had never seen him like this. Tumtum was usually such a calm and mellow mouse, and she found his fits terribly unnerving. The anxiety was taking its toll on her, and by the 5th day of Tumtum's illness, she had lost nearly half an ounce in weight, almost as much as he had. That evening she tried to eat some bread and cheese, but her stomach was in knots, and she found she could barely swallow. As the hours ticked by, Nutmeg started to brood, clutching her husband's paw. She couldn't stop thinking of the children's betrayal. How could they have done something so dreadful? What had she and Tumtum done to incur such hatred? All we did was try and make the attic more comfortable, she thought mournfully. Surely they couldn't have objected to that. Somehow, Nutmeg suspected that Aunt Ivy must have something to do with it, and yet Aunt Ivy could never have known that she and Tumtum were making use of the dollhouse unless the children had told her so. And why would they do that? Nutmeg felt quite weak trying to make sense of it all. Since adopting Arthur and Lucy, she had felt for the first time that her family was complete, and the thought they had turned on her made her feel quite broken-hearted. Since Tumtum had been taken ill, all the excitement and bustle had gone out of her. She was quite a different mouse from what she'd been before. The night stole away, and still she brooded, feeling too overwrought to sleep. If only I had some sewing to do, she thought longingly, for sewing always took her mind off things. But she had left her sewing basket in the dollhouse. She looked at her watch. It was after midnight. Everyone would be fast asleep, she thought. I don't suppose there can be any harm in going to get it. And once feeling a little better for having a sense of purpose, she fetched the flashlight from the kitchen and went to the front gate. The cottage was dark and still. No one was stirring. She crept through the kitchen and into the hall, then cocked an ear at the living room door and heard Aunt Ivy snoring. Feeling bolder, she went upstairs. The moon was shining in the attic window, and Nutmeg could see the children's heads asleep on their pillows. Part of her longed to get close to them and to brush their hair again with her broom, and yet for the first time she felt wary. The room looked dusty and neglected, for it was more than a week since she'd last cleaned. The dollhouse had been untouched since she and Tumtum's last visit, and it had a sad, abandoned feel to it. Tumtum's book was still on the kitchen floor where he dropped it, and her sewing basket was where she always left it, in the cupboard under the stairs. I must get straight home, she thought, tucking the basket over her arm. If Tumtum comes too, he'll wonder where I am. She hurried out of the dollhouse, carefully closing the front door behind her, then picked her way across the attic floor, over a pile of dirty socks. She was about to rush back down the steps when some instinct made her shine her flashlight up toward the dresser, and she saw a letter propped against Lucy's hairbrush. It was addressed to Nutmeg. Nervous it might be another trap, Nutmeg climbed up a pair of blue tights that was tumbling from the top drawer and went to investigate. She looked anxiously toward the children's bed, then unfolded the letter, spreading it out flat on the dresser. The writing was so big that she had to take a step back in order to read it. Dear Nutmeg, we have missed you so much. Please come back. Arthur is very sorry that he told Aunt Ivy about how you visit us and how we leave your supper in the dollhouse. But he only said it by mistake, and he wouldn't have said it if he thought it would make you vanish. We wish you would come back and make vanish. We wish you could come back and make Aunt Ivy vanish instead. Love, Arthur and Lucy. Nutmeg read it once. Then she read it again. And then she felt so overcome she had to sit down on the handle of Lucy's hairbrush to compose herself. Alas, everything fell into place. If poor, impetuous Arthur had told Aunt Ivy that a fairy came and ate crumbs in the dollhouse, then she might reasonably have suspected that his fairy was one of the mice she had seen on the landing. And then she must have crept up here at night with murderous intent. Nutmeg felt a great rush of relief as she realized that the children hadn't betrayed them after all. Oh, bless them, she thought. I knew that dreadful woman must have been behind it all. She was anxious to get back to Tumtum, but she knew she must leave a reply. There was a red pencil lying on the far side of the dresser. She picked it up and held it with both arms, steadying it against her chest as she scrawled a hurried note on the back of the children's letter. Dear Arthur and Lucy, please do not think I have abandoned you. Now that your aunt knows our secret, it is more difficult for me to visit, but I am still thinking of you. Love, Nutmeg. Then Nutmeg added a very defiant P.S. I will make Aunt Ivy vanish. I promise. And she vowed to herself to keep that promise. I must get rid of her, she thought, feeling a sudden thrill of determination. And I will get rid of her. But how? She bounced down the attic steps, ran across the landing, and slid down the banister, her mind whirring. She had magnificent visions of herself chasing a terrified Aunt Ivy down the garden path, snapping at her heels and driving her away from Rose Cottage, never to return. In her excitement, she quite forgot that Aunt Ivy was several hundred times bigger than she was. Nutmeg's mind was still galloping as she crossed the hall and ran under the kitchen door, was galloping so much that she didn't notice the kitchen light had been turned on. We'll show her who's boss, Nutmeg thought as she sauntered jauntily across the floor. Tumtum will get better, and then we'll let her know who owns this place. She skirted a patch of grease in front of the cooker, then paused to look down her nose at one of the mousetraps. She was feeling quite extraordinarily ebullient. But then there was a shattering human scream, and in that instant, Nutmeg saw the tips of Aunt Ivy's slippers just in front of her nose, standing between her and the dresser. Nutmeg stopped dead in her tracks. She knew Aunt Ivy would do something dreadful, yet she felt unable to move. A dark shadow slowly began to engulf her. As Aunt Ivy's arm rose upward, then there was a rapid blur as a teapot came hurtling through the air toward her. It smashed to the floor millimeters from Nutmeg's feet, sending splinters of china ricocheting all around. There's a picture of her when she was coming down the banister. It smashed to the floor millimeters from sending splinters of china ricocheting all around. Senseless with panic, she hurtled right over Aunt Ivy's slippers and ran straight under the dresser with her sewing basket swinging wildly back and forth on her arm. Oh, what a fool I am. What a fool, she thought as she drenched open the gates. Now she knows where we live. She'll be back for us again. She'll pull out the dresser. She'll find Nutmouse Hall. No sooner had Nutmeg turned the key in the padlock than there was a fierce shaft of light. Aunt Ivy was on the floor, shining her flashlight directly on her. Nutmeg threw herself back from the gate, out of sight, but it could make little difference now. Aunt Ivy knew where they lived. Chapter 8. Nutmeg stood shaking in the broom cupboard as Aunt Ivy pulled and heaved at the dresser. At one point, she made it lurch so far forward that all the plates fell off and smashed on the floor. Nutmeg saw a splinter of china fly through the gate, and then there was a deep thud as the dresser crashed back against the wall. Exhausted, Aunt Ivy stood a while, cursing under her breath. She had seen where Nutmeg went, so she was no longer in any doubt that the funny metal grid was some sort of mouse hole. She wanted to block it up so the mice would be imprisoned in their lair and slowly starve to death. But the dresser was too heavy for her to move. She pondered a while, then had an idea, which pleased her so much that she said it out loud. Gas, she announced, clapping her hands together with glee. I'll pump poisonous gas under the dresser straight into their filthy little hole. We'll see how they like that. And just thinking about it made her feel much more cheerful. On the other side of the door, Nutmeg listened in terror. Gas! Gas, she said to herself, quaking. She imagined clouds of foul blue poison being pumped through the gates, curling in under the front door and advancing through Nutmouse Hall, room by room, slowly choking her and Tumtum to death. Beside herself, she ran inside and locked the front door behind her, putting the draft excluder in place. Then she raced around each of her 36 rooms, upstairs and down, locking all the windows and drawing all the curtains. She found a roll of masking tape in the butler's pantry and darted back to the hall, using it to seal around the frame of the front door. But she knew it was hopeless. The gas would find its own way in. It would advance through the joins in the window frames. It would creep in through the pipes and belch from the taps. It would diffuse down the chimneys. We must escape, she thought. But Tumtum was much too ill to be moved. The upheaval would kill him, even if the gas didn't. Numb with dread, she went back to her husband's bedside. He was sleeping, and his face looked pale and sallow. All night long, the distraught Nutmeg sat beside him, wondering what to do. If only Tumtum were himself. She felt sure he would be able to think of something. But his mind was still wandering, and when he opened his eyes, he appeared not to recognize her. Oh, what is to become of us, Nutmeg thought hopelessly. Tumtum's delirious, and Aunt Ivy might strike at any moment. She put her head in her paws and closed her eyes tight, trying to shut out the horror. Their chances of survival seemed horribly thin. But the truth is that Aunt Ivy had no idea what sort of gas to use, nor where to buy it. The only deadly gas she knew about was cyanide, and she imagined it might be hard to come by. Like Nutmeg, Aunt Ivy spent a restless night dwelling on her difficulties, and she was still dwelling on them the next morning when she locked herself in the bathroom. Aunt Ivy always locked herself in the bathroom for at least an hour, both in the morning and in the evening, usually at just the time everyone else wanted to use it. And she sprayed so many foul-smelling scents and deodorants on herself that whoever went in afterwards had to press a flannel over their noses. This morning she was applying something particularly revolting, a hairspray with a sweet, citrusy aroma, a bit like compost. It came out in dense green clouds, and it made her hair very dark and greasy, just as she liked it. When she had applied several layers, she looked at herself approvingly in the mirror, then made to throw the empty canister in the bin. But something on the label caught her eye. "Danger," it said in big red letters. "Very toxic. Excessive inhalation may cause injury or death." Aunt Ivy started to feel a delicious tickle in her spine. Why, she thought, if gas could kill a human, then it shouldn't. Oops. Oh, goodness. Be hard to kill a couple of mice with it. I'll buy some more and gas them to death tonight. Then she got dressed much more quickly than usual and went down the lane to the village shop. When she arrived, Mrs. Patterson was behind the counter eating a thick piece of toast. There was butter dribbling down her chin. Oh, I didn't show you the picture of Aunt Ivy. She looks just terrible. She's thinking about that. Oh, she's so self-satisfied. There was butter dribbling down her apron. "Did the mouse poison do the job, Mrs. Mildew?" she asked good-naturedly. Aunt Ivy did not appear to hear her. "Do you have any more of these?" she asked briskly, slamming the empty hairspray down beside the till. "I bought it here last week." As Aunt Ivy leaned toward her, Mrs. Patterson picked up a foul, toxic smell, almost like a gas leak. It made her feel quite queasy. "Sorry," she said, wrinkling her nose. "I've none in stock. Next delivery comes in at noon on Saturday." Aunt Ivy leaned forward on the counter and looked at her piercingly. "Reserve me 2 canisters," she demanded icily. But then, as Mrs. Patterson wrote down the order, Aunt Ivy started to wonder whether 2 canisters would be enough. There might be more mice than the 2 she'd seen. They might have brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. They might have bread. On second thought, "Make that 5, she said grimly. Then she stomped back outside, knocking over a pile of newspapers. Chapter 9. Nutmeg waited all that day, braced for a gas attack, but none came. And yet she felt sure that Aunt Ivy would strike soon. All the while, the promise she had made to the children rang around and around in her head. "I will get rid of Aunt Ivy. I will, I will, I will." And now she knew that she must, if she could only think how. By tea time, which had become a meaningless time, since Tumtum was too weak to eat and Nutmeg too nervous, she could bear it no longer. If she didn't do something soon, she felt she would go mad. "Oh, Tumtum, we can't just sit here waiting to be gassed by that dreadful woman," she said, anxiously rearranging his blankets. He was sleeping and much too ill to follow what she was saying, but talking out loud made her feel better all the same. "We must get rid of her. Oh, I wish I knew how." As Nutmeg was musing, Tumtum slowly raised one eyelid, then another. Then he turned his hollow face toward her. His eyes were sunken deep in their sockets. "Fetch General March Mouse," he whispered hoarsely, his lips barely moving. Then his eyelids at once drooped shut again. "General March Mouse!" Nutmeg exclaimed delightedly, clutching her husband's paw as he slipped out of consciousness. "Oh, why didn't I think of him before? Oh, Tumtum, you are so clever." It was the first sense he had made all week. And Nutmeg wondered if he'd been talking in his sleep. But it was a wonderful idea all the same, because just repeating the general's name made her feel a warm glow about her. He was considered to be one of the great military geniuses of the age, and in the past he had delivered the village mice from all manner of threats. He once saw a rabble of looting rats from the granary. He got rid of them, even though they outnumbered his mouse soldiers by 3 to 1. After that, the Mouse Times described him as undefeatable, and that was the general view. He had retired from the army a few months ago and was by no means in the first flush of youth, but every mouse still had great faith in him. "I suppose he's never gone to war with a human before," Nutmeg thought, feeling a flicker of apprehension. But anyway, she said to herself firmly, if anyone can save us, then General March Mouse can. She decided to go and consult him immediately while Tumtum was sleeping. She kissed him on the nose, then ran to the kitchen and flung on her cape. The general and his wife lived in a disused gun cupboard in the manor house, which was owned by an elderly human couple called Mr. and Mrs. Stirrup. The manor house was just beyond Rose Cottage, on the edge of the village. Nutmeg knew the route well, for she and Tumtum had often dined with the Marchmouses in happier times. Even allowing for the snow, she reckoned she could be there and back within the hour. But as she went to let herself out the front gates, she heard voices carrying from the kitchen. It was Aunt Ivy and Mr. Mildew discussing them. I saw one of them on my own eyes, Walter, disappearing under there. Peering out through the gate, Nutmeg could just see the tip of Ivy's finger pointing toward the dresser. They've got a nest somewhere behind that metal grill. That's possible, Mr. Mildew said, sounding preoccupied. The only mouse he was interested in was the battery-operated crumb gobbler he was inventing. The department store that had once sold his grape peelers wanted to stock it, so if he could only get it working, it might make him rich again. But he'd been battling with the digestive system for weeks now, and the mouse was still throwing everything up. It was all giving Mr. Mildew the most dreadful headache. Can't you help me move the dresser, Walter, so I can get a closer look? Ivy whined. Nutmeg stood behind the broom cupboard door, holding her breath. No, Ivy, Mr. Mildew replied firmly. That dresser weighs a ton and hasn't been moved for years, and I'm not going to break my back just because you think you've seen a couple of mice wearing aprons. They weren't both wearing aprons. One was in a tweed suit, she retorted crossly. Anyway, I'll be getting rid of them on Saturday. Will you? Mr. Mildew said vaguely. Yes, she replied mysteriously. Saturday at noon, when my gas supplies arrive. Oh, really, Ivy, Mr. Mildew said, picking up his cup of coffee and making for the door. I've never heard such nonsense. I'm going to wipe them out with a toxic hairspray, she called after him as he went upstairs. One whiff of that and they'll choke instantly. Mr. Mildew was no longer listening, but Nutmeg had heard every word. Saturday at noon, she thought, her pulse racing. That's the day after tomorrow. She let herself out the gates, then belted across the kitchen floor while Aunt Ivy's back was turned, reckless with urgency. There she goes. She's off to find the general. Nutmeg hurtled. Just making sure I'm on the right page. Yes, I'm sorry. Hurtled under the door into the garden. It was a beautiful afternoon. There was no wind, and the snow was shining pink in the twilight. She ran along the edge of the lawn under the cover of the hedge, then crossed onto the manor house garden. She took her usual route through the apple orchard, into the vegetable patch, over the potato beds, under the lean-to of wintering sweet peas, then up the clematis on the side of the house, and indoors through the broken window pane in the downstairs cloakroom. From the sill, she dropped down onto the toilet seat and then to the floor. She crept to the door and poked her nose into the long, tiled corridor. It had just been bleached, and the fumes made her eyes water. The door to the kitchen opposite was ajar, and she could see the two manor house Labradors curled up asleep together in their basket. When General Marchmouse had first moved in, the dogs had been notoriously ill-mannered and had growled and snapped at the general's dinner guests. But the general had bashed the dogs both on the nose with his rifle, and now they were said to be more docile. Even so, the sight of them made Nutmeg uneasy, so she tiptoed past the kitchen door and then ran down the corridor as fast as she could, skidding and scuttling on the polished tiles until she came to the gun room finally, which was the last door on the right. The gun cupboard was a handsome oak chest, nearly 6 feet tall. There were no guns in it now, as Mr. Stirrup had given up shooting when his eyesight started to fail, so the Marchmouses had the whole cupboard to themselves. Thank goodness they're at home, Nutmeg thought, seeing the light from inside glinting out of the keyhole. She crept around to the back of the cupboard where the Marchmouses had carved out their front door. It was the general who opened it, wearing a blue and white striped apron. He was holding a rolling pin and looked flustered. His face was red, and his whiskers were covered with flour. Mrs. Nutmouse, he said delightedly. Come in. What a nice surprise. He drew her into the hall. There were spears and shields hanging on the wall, and above the fire there was a glass cabinet containing a stuffed cockroach the general had shot himself. He propelled her through to the kitchen where his wife was whisking eggs. She looked flustered, too. We're expecting 11 of my brother officers for dinner, the general explained importantly, and I'm in command of the fish pie. He sat Nutmeg down at the kitchen table and started debriefing her as to his recipe. Salmon, cod, king prawns, nutmeg, mature cheddar, a sprinkling of salt and pepper. On he boasted, hardly seeming to notice Nutmeg's distraught expression. Here she is in the kitchen with both of the March Mouses. But Mrs. March Mouse saw it at once. Hush, darling, she urged her husband. Mrs. Nutmouse has something to tell us. The general finally drew breath, and Nutmeg was able to let the whole dreadful story tumble out. Tripping over her words in haste, she told them how Tumtum was lying at home, delirious and poisoned, and about the dastardly Aunt Ivy, and how she was plotting a gas attack at noon on Saturday. And Nutmeg told them of her fears that in Tumtum's present condition, even the slightest whiff of one of Aunt Ivy's grotesque hairsprays might kill him. Listening to the drama, Mrs. Marchmarce's eyes glazed with horror, while the general's eyes began to blaze. An adventure, he thought, feeling his heart stir. The general was a mouse who had lived for adventures. They were his lifeblood, his first love, and since retiring from the army, he had found them surprisingly hard to come by. What luck, he thought as Nutmeg finished her terrifying tale. A war zone just next door in Rose Cottage. In his mind, he could already hear the thud of the cannonballs and smell the gunpowder. Oh, General Marchmouse, do you think you could help us? Nutmeg asked plaintively. Oh, yes, Mrs. Nutmouse, the general said heartily. I shall assemble an army to repel her. We shall fight from the beams. We shall fight from the rafters. We shall hurl hand grenades from coffee cups. We shall fire machine guns from the fruit bowl. We shall never surrender. Then he thumped his rolling pin down on the table with a mighty crash. Nutmeg felt very reassured. He sounded like a mouse who meant business. And that's our 3 chapters for today. Will General Marchmouse be able to get rid of Aunt Ivy? Tune in next week for the next 3 chapters of Tumtum and Nutmeg Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. I hope you enjoyed today's chapters. Get out and enjoy the sunshine. It's a beautiful day today, and we're supposed to get some more rain, which is needed, but get out and enjoy that sunshine. Miss you lots. Take care. Bye.